Have you ever felt like God is taking too long? Like you've prayed, waited, and yet nothing is changing? You see others moving forward, receiving blessings, stepping into their next season, but your life feels stuck in the same place. You start wondering if you've done something wrong, if maybe you missed your opportunity, if God has forgotten about you. The waiting feels endless, and the silence feels heavy. The longer it takes, the harder it becomes to trust that something is actually happening behind the scenes. Maybe you've even thought, if I don't act now, I'll miss my chance. The pressure to make things happen becomes overwhelming. You start looking for ways to push forward, to open doors that seem closed, to force what God has not yet released. But what if I told you that rushing God's plan could actually be delaying your breakthrough? What if trying to control the timing is the very thing keeping you from receiving what He has prepared for you? The enemy wants you to believe that waiting is wasting time, that if you don't take matters into your own hands, you'll miss out. But the truth is, when you move ahead of God, you step outside of His protection, His provision, and His perfect will. Throughout the Bible, we see that God's timing is never early, never late, but always perfect. Every great move of God required a waiting season, and every time someone tried to rush His process, it led to unnecessary struggles. Abraham and Sarah couldn't wait for God's promise, so they took matters into their own hands, leading to years of conflict and pain. Moses tried to deliver Israel before it was time, and it cost him 40 years in the wilderness. Even Jesus waited until the exact moment the Father appointed for Him to step into His ministry. So why do we struggle so much with waiting? Because we fear losing control. We want guarantees, certainty, and immediate answers. But faith requires trust. Trust that God sees what we cannot see. Trust that His plan is greater than ours. Trust that when the time is right, nothing will be able to stop what He has ordained. Stay with me, because in the next few minutes, I'll show you why God's timing is always perfect, and why moving ahead of Him could cost you more than you think. I'll also give you the keys to waiting well, so that instead of feeling stuck, you'll feel secure in the fact that God is working all things together for your good. If you're in a waiting season, if you're feeling restless, if you're tempted to rush ahead, this message is for you. And by the end, you'll have the faith to trust that what God is preparing for you is worth the wait. Imagine planting a seed. You carefully place it in the soil, water it, and make sure it gets enough sunlight. You check on it every day, expecting to see growth. But after a few days, nothing happens. The ground looks exactly the same. You start to get impatient. Maybe the seed isn't growing. Maybe something is wrong. Maybe it needs a little help. So you decide to dig it up, to check on it, to see if anything is happening beneath the surface. But in doing so, you disturb its roots, disrupt its process, and instead of helping it grow, you kill what was meant to flourish. This is exactly what happens when we try to rush God's plan. Instead of trusting the process, we attempt to force things before they're ready, and in doing so, we end up hurting what God was preparing for us. We don't see progress as quickly as we want, so we step in, trying to manipulate the outcome, trying to speed up what God has intentionally placed on a divine timeline. But just like that seed, growth happens in the unseen before it appears in the visible. If we don't trust that process, we risk destroying what God was carefully cultivating for the perfect season. We live in a world that glorifies speed, fast results, instant success, quick answers. We are conditioned to believe that waiting is wasting time, but in God's kingdom, waiting is never wasted. The process of waiting is where faith is built, character is refined, and preparation happens. Every delay, every moment of silence, every closed door is part of a bigger picture that we cannot yet see. God is not just working on the situation, He is working in us. He is strengthening our trust, refining our patience, and ensuring that when the promise arrives, we are ready to receive it. But when we rush ahead of God, we take matters into our own hands, and often settle for less than His best. We step into relationships that aren't meant for us. We accept opportunities that are not aligned with His purpose. We force doors open that were meant to remain closed. And instead of walking in the fullness of His plan, we find ourselves exhausted, frustrated, and struggling with things we were never meant to carry. Think of a cake baking in the oven. If you take it out too soon, it looks fine on the outside, but inside it's still raw, unfinished, and not ready to be enjoyed. No matter how hungry you are, taking it out early ruins what it was meant to become. The same is true for God's timing. If we move ahead of Him, we miss out on the full, complete, and perfect outcome He had planned. God's process is intentional. He sees the bigger picture, the things we cannot yet understand. What looks like a delay is actually divine alignment. What feels like a pause is actually preparation. What seems like silence is actually God working behind the scenes, setting everything in motion for the exact right time. If you're feeling impatient, if you're tempted to force something that isn't happening yet, pause. Trust that the seed is growing. Trust that the promise is developing beneath the surface. Trust that when the time is right, it will bloom into something greater than you ever expected. Because when God is the one in control of the process, the outcome is always better than anything we could have created on our own. Ecclesiastes 3:1 says, "To everything there is a season, a time for every purpose under heaven." This verse is a powerful reminder that God operates on a divine timeline. Every promise, every breakthrough, every answered prayer has a specific moment when it is meant to unfold. There is a right time for everything in your life, and if you step out too soon, you might miss what God had planned for you. Waiting is not about denial, it is about alignment. When God gives you a vision, a dream, or a promise, it is easy to assume that it should happen immediately. But just because He reveals something to you does not mean He intends for it to happen right now. There is always a process between the promise and the fulfillment. The waiting season is where God refines your character, builds your faith, and ensures that when the promise comes, you are ready to carry it. Look at Moses. He knew he was called to free the Israelites, but when he tried to do it in his own strength, before God's timing, he ended up running for his life and spending 40 years in the wilderness. Instead of waiting for God's direction, Moses took action on his own. He saw an Egyptian mistreating an Israelite and decided to intervene by killing the Egyptian. Though his intentions were right, his timing was wrong. Instead of leading his people to freedom, he was forced to flee, spending decades in isolation. But during that time, God was preparing him. God was teaching him how to be a leader, how to rely on divine wisdom rather than human strength. And when the time was right, God called Moses back, not as a fugitive, but as a deliverer. This time, Moses did not act in haste. He acted in obedience. What if Moses had waited the first time? What if he had trusted God's plan instead of trying to force it? How much pain, fear, and delay could have been avoided? The same principle applies to our lives. When we rush ahead of God, we often create unnecessary detours. We end up taking longer routes, facing hardships that could have been avoided, and experiencing frustration that was never part of God's plan. This is why trusting in God's timing is so important. His ways are higher than ours. He sees what we cannot see. He knows when you are ready, when the circumstances are aligned, and when the right doors will open. If you step out too soon, you risk settling for something less than His best. But if you trust His process, when the right time comes, nothing will be able to stop what He has ordained for your life. If you are in a season of waiting, do not mistake it for inactivity. God is working behind the scenes. He is preparing the path ahead of you. He is strengthening you so that when the promise arrives, you will be able to carry it well. Because when the timing is divine, everything falls into place perfectly, exactly as He intended. When you rush, you often accept something less than what God had for you. Impatience can lead you to settle for something that looks good in the moment, but is not aligned with God's best. The temptation to take shortcuts, to force open doors, and to make things happen in your own strength can seem like a solution, but in reality, it only creates unnecessary struggles. God's plan is not just about giving you what you want. It is about giving you what you need at the right time so that it will be a blessing and not a burden. Look at Sarah and Abraham. God promised them a son, but as time passed, they grew impatient. Instead of trusting that God would fulfill His word in the right season, they took matters into their own hands. Sarah suggested that Abraham have a child with her servant Hagar, and Ishmael was born. But rather than bringing fulfillment, this decision led to conflict, jealousy, and generational struggle. The very thing they tried to rush became a source of pain. Eventually, God did fulfill His promise, and Isaac was born at the right time according to God's plan. But their impatience caused unnecessary heartache that could have been avoided if they had simply waited. This is what happens when we try to manufacture blessings instead of waiting for divine ones. What looks like a shortcut often turns into a detour. We get into relationships that God never intended for us. We take jobs that seem like opportunities but lead us further away from our purpose. We make decisions based on fear rather than faith, trying to control what only God can orchestrate. And instead of stepping into God's perfect will, we find ourselves struggling with the consequences of a choice that was never meant to be made. Sometimes God has to take you through extra lessons because you moved too fast, and now He has to correct your course. Rushing ahead can actually delay what God had for you, because now He has to undo what was done in haste before He can move you forward. This is why the Israelites took 40 years to reach the Promised Land, when the journey should have taken only weeks. Their impatience, lack of trust, and constant complaining made them miss the lesson God was trying to teach them. Instead of stepping into the promise, they wandered in circles, repeating the same mistakes, delaying what could have been theirs much sooner. How many times do we do the same? How often do we extend our struggles simply because we refuse to trust God's process? When we take things into our own hands, we create battles we were never meant to fight, delays we were never meant to experience, and burdens we were never meant to carry. The pain is not always in the waiting. It is often in the consequences of not waiting. If you are feeling restless, tempted to force something to happen before it's time, pause. Take a step back and ask yourself, is this God's timing, or am I trying to rush the process? Is this an Ishmael, or is it an Isaac? The difference between the two is simple. One is the result of human impatience. The other is the result of divine promise. One brings struggle, the other brings blessing. One comes with regret, the other comes with joy. The waiting season is not about God withholding something from you. It is about positioning you to receive it at the right time, in the right way, without unnecessary struggle. If you trust Him, if you wait well, if you refuse to settle for less, you will step into something greater than you could have ever created on your own. Because when God fulfills His promise, it is always better, always complete, and always exactly what you needed. Instead of praying, "God, hurry up," start praying, "God, have your way." Shifting your focus from urgency to surrender changes everything. When we ask God to move faster, we are still trying to control the outcome. But when we ask Him to have His way, we are acknowledging that His plan is greater than ours. Surrendering the timeline means letting go of frustration, impatience, and the need to force things. It means trusting that if something isn't happening yet, it's because the right time has not arrived. God sees the full picture while we only see a small part of it. He knows exactly when the breakthrough should come so that it aligns with His perfect will. When you release the need to rush, you step into a place of peace because you recognize that God is never late, never early, always on time. If God is making you wait, it's because He's working on you, the opportunity, or both. Many times we think we are waiting on God, but in reality, He is waiting on us to be ready. He is refining our character, strengthening our faith, and removing anything that would keep us from fully stepping into His blessing. What if your delay is actually your preparation? What if what you are waiting for would overwhelm you if it came too soon? God is not only preparing the promise, He is preparing you to handle it well. He doesn't just want to bless you, He wants you to be able to sustain the blessing once it arrives. Look at Joseph. He had dreams of greatness, of ruling, of walking in a powerful calling, but he did not step into his destiny immediately. He spent years in prison, falsely accused, seemingly forgotten. If anyone had a reason to feel like God was taking too long, it was Joseph. But what Joseph didn't realize was that every hardship, every setback, every moment of waiting was shaping him into the leader he was meant to be. Then, in one single day, everything changed. He went from prisoner to ruler overnight. The delay was not wasted time, it was God's training ground, and when the time was right, nothing could stop what God had planned for him. God's timing isn't just about the outcome, it's about who you become in the process. Many people think the waiting season is about patience, but it's also about obedience and faithfulness. Will you keep trusting God when you don't see progress? Will you keep believing when nothing changes? Will you stay committed to Him when the timeline doesn't match your expectations? The people who see God's greatest blessings are the ones who remain faithful even in the waiting. They don't give up. They don't rush ahead. They don't compromise. They continue to serve, to pray, to prepare, because they understand that the waiting season is just as important as the breakthrough. If you're in a season where things feel slow, uncertain, or delayed, don't waste it. Use this time to deepen your relationship with God, to build your faith, to let Him refine you. Instead of fighting the process, embrace it. Instead of asking, "Why is this taking so long?" start asking, "Lord, what do you want to teach me in this season?" Because the faster you align yourself with His will, the sooner you will step into everything He has prepared for you. And when the time is right, nothing will be able to stop what God is about to do in your life. God's timing is not to punish you, it's to position you for something greater than you imagined. What feels like a delay is actually divine preparation. What seems like silence is actually God working behind the scenes, aligning every detail so that when the right moment comes, everything will fall into place effortlessly. You may not see it yet, but that doesn't mean it isn't happening. The job you've been praying for, the breakthrough you've been waiting on, the relationship you've been believing for, God has not forgotten you. He is preparing you for it, and He is preparing it for you. When He moves, it will be so perfectly aligned that you will look back and understand why He made you wait. If you feel like things are taking too long, remember, God is never late. He is never behind schedule. He is never caught off guard. He knows exactly when to release the right opportunities, open the right doors, and bring the right people into your life. Your waiting season is not wasted time. It is God's strategic timing. Think of a puzzle. Each piece has a place, and if you try to force one into the wrong position, it doesn't fit. But when you let the picture come together as it was designed, it makes sense. God is building something in your life, and when the time is right, every piece will come together perfectly. When that moment comes, it will be sudden. One day, Joseph was in a prison cell. The next, he was ruling a nation. One day, Sarah was barren. The next, she was holding her promised child. One day, the Israelites were trapped by the Red Sea. The next, they were walking through on dry ground. When God moves, He moves quickly, but only at the right time. So if you are waiting, do not grow weary. Do not let doubt convince you that God has forgotten you. Hold on, because when your moment comes, nothing will be able to stop it. Comment, "I will wait on God," if you trust His perfect timing. Let this be your declaration of faith, that you will not rush ahead, that you will not settle, that you will wait for God's best. And if this message encouraged you, share it with someone who needs this reminder today. You never know whose faith might be strengthened just by hearing these words. Before you go, make sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an encouraging word. And if this message blessed you, hit the like button. It helps spread this word to more people who need it. Let's grow in faith together, trusting that God's timing is perfect and knowing that what He has for you is worth the wait. Keep believing, keep trusting, and get ready, because when God moves, everything will change in an instant.